When a big game like Final Fantasy XIV initially releases, or re-releases perhaps, it is perfectly understandable that there are some hiccups, oddities, and things that need ironing out. And definitely, many things have been ironed out over the years. A decade ago, weaving was far more awkward than it is now. Half a decade ago, it was incredibly likely that deployment tactics would flat out miss the galvanized shield if you weaved it immediately after Adloquium. However, there are also a whole bunch of things in Final Fantasy XIV that either doesn't seem to be that important or otherwise simply have been kind of left behind. Some of these things are somewhat natural evolutions of an MMO that has been around for many years, and others are just a bit weird. So let's talk about that. For a mild start, have you ever explored the concept of figuring out your ping in Final Fantasy XIV? Some of you might now think, of course, I point at the wavy Wi-Fi symbol thing in the top right. That'll tell me, right? Sending? Receiving? What does that mean? As far as I know, this kind of information is possibly helpful for diagnosing a connection issue perhaps, but it is, broadly speaking, completely unhelpful for the average user. Which means that typically, checking your ping, while not particularly difficult, is rather roundabout for a game released around 2013. Find the IP address of the specific data center you wish to test. Then, for example, open Command Prompt on Windows and ping that. See what it says. There are other ways, of course, but this is rather strange, don't you think? The second thing I would bring up, a lot bigger, simply is the roulette system itself. It works. It didn't stop working, but it is a system that was made over a decade ago and for the most part has mainly seen more and more content shoved into it. Things in the game have also changed around the roulette itself. In Stormblood, typically, every major patch had enough new and recent duties that Expert Roulette had at least 3 things, not just the first few patches. Technically, when the roulette system was initially implemented, it was in a time where duties were more creatively sprinkled out over the leveling experience itself, adding more variety to leveling dungeons. Granted, for the rest of the roulette system's life, each expansion has somewhat consistently added a similar experience to it. Now, the problem I would like to highlight here is that a very common complaint about the various roulettes tends to almost always focus on older duties being way too common. Sure, yes, sometimes leveling roulette gives you a duty relevant for your level range, but surprisingly often, or is it really surprising, you land in an A Realm Reborn duty. You queue for Alliance Raid Roulette, and while anything is possible, Crystal Tower is the most possible outcome. You queue for normal raids, again, anything could happen, but Alexander is the most likely outcome. Now, this itself may not at all be a problem. In fact, it might be entirely intentional that the roulette has been left as it is like this. After all, many of these roulettes serve as a way to give higher level players reason to come back and help the newer players through the various content. However, sometimes forced by not offering alternatives lead to their own problems. One way to help even out the variety in roulettes would be to split up some of the roulettes in more packages. For instance, imagine if the high-level dungeons were split up in 2 packages, one with A Realm Reborn, Heavensward and Stormblood, and another with Shadowbringers and Endwalker. Obviously, as Dawntrail evolves, level 100 dungeons will be a roulette that appears as dungeons slide out of Expert. It is of course perfectly possible that splitting up the roulette in this way just means that the higher level one exclusively ends up being certain Shadowbringers dungeons and the quote-unquote problem just expands. However, as it stands right now, there are a significant amount of players that pick around roulettes where they feel they tend to get the same stuff every time. So doing nothing is also a bit of a lose-lose situation. There are also other ways to go about this. The main observation I'm trying to make about the roulette problem here is that when leveling roulette was invented in Final Fantasy XIV, there were around 12 duties in total that went in leveling roulette. Now there are 37, and by the design of how the game works, lower level duties are simply more likely to appear, as everyone will have Sastasha, everyone will have Tamtara, pretty much everyone has Copperbell, and as we continue upwards, less and less people will have the duties, or alternatively be the level to do them. Just one way to make a bit more variety and break up this particular problem a bit would be to split some of the roulettes into more smaller packages, as I mentioned. Another suggestion I've heard is making it so various roulettes cover specific duties, rotating every day, similar to how Frontline works. It could also rotate every hour and a half or some such, like how Crystalline Conflict works. This could very effectively ensure all roulettes have some more variety, but comes with the other concern that it could lead to someone having a long queue simply because they happen to reach a duty in the MSQ when it just rotated out. So this might not be the best solution, but it is at least a thought. Maybe have the regular roulettes and then maybe have some sort of variety roulette separately that rotates. I don't know, this video isn't about solutions, it's about pointing out the things. Let's move on. The third thing, I feel I should preempt with the observation that it is perfectly normal for long-running games, or even long-running software, or even companies in general, to have this. But Final Fantasy XIV has a bit of a problem with various started and stopped projects. Content types or categories that are initiated in a given expansion and then left behind as we move on. Normally, this kind of stuff naturally cycles out, as this old content is quite clearly fully outdated content that I guess you could run around in for the fun of it, but the fights are probably trivial, and any reason beyond cosmetics are gone. But in Final Fantasy XIV, these kinds of started and stopped, or alternatively finished, projects stand out a bit more in a weird way. For instance, old ultimates can extend to make old relics relevant, which then makes the content these old relics are associated with relevant. And due to the various syncing systems of Final Fantasy XIV, it all stays significant. Now, the problem is more about the fact that some of this content can get really difficult to actually do as less and less people care to do it. For instance, an example is Bozja, although it is still perfectly doable. A better example of sort of old abandoned content is the Crafter Specialist system. Originally, the idea, I suppose, was that while you could level everything, you had to specialize and choose certain crafters as your mains, which limited what things among the best equipment and items you could make. As this feature was not super well received, nowadays, Specialist gives 3 of your crafters a slight stat boost across the board, enables access to 3 Specialist actions that can be used a limited number of times per craft, and it enables you to craft, assuming the correct Specialist, the newest Chocobo Barding, the newest Extreme Bust, and the newest Orchestrion rolls. In other words, it is limited to a point where it hardly matters, but it is still there for some reason. Now, the thing I feel is the biggest concern about many of these started and stopped projects is the need and dedication to keep them functional. In an MMO where new content replaces the old content and the old content becomes easily beatable with time, the development team can focus on moving forward. In Final Fantasy XIV, however, as for example, the old ultimates from Stormblood are still relevant today. Sure, the power creep has made them easier. Making 2 drastic changes in the game could suddenly make them unbeatable. This could apply to pretty much any content where unsynced is not allowed. Indeed, the fact unsynced isn't allowed is what still gives it some prestige, so I'm not sitting here saying that the ultimate should be unsyncable, but rather that any major overhaul to how jobs or roles function could make these old ultimates too difficult rather than just more difficult. For instance, a common conversation in recent months, if not years, is that healers need some changes. Similar conversations include that tanks are very self-sufficient. If, for instance, healers were made more reliant on GCD healing, then their damage would suddenly plummet, and unless other jobs get increased damage to compensate, suddenly a DPS check that might have been perfectly manageable no longer is. Imagine we replace tank invulns with extremely potent damage reduction, like for instance 80% damage reduction, so that you still have crazy powerful cooldowns, but you can't use invulns to straight up cheese mechanics anymore. Many old fights suddenly skyrocket in difficulty. There may be cases where the gold standard strategy of using invuln simply was an option, but if there is a single mechanic in a synced encounter designed to assume you have an invuln, that has to be changed. Otherwise, the fight is suddenly no longer beatable. And by the design of the game, that cannot happen. It makes it really difficult for the development team to adjust things. Sure, we have seen so many buffs over the years that a lot of content has become ridiculously easy as a result, but that's exactly it. Any change that makes things easier will not break anything by making it unbeatable, but any change that makes things harder might break things. It will also, admittedly, make some players annoyed. Often, quality of life and buffs are well appreciated, and regardless of whether they are good for the health of the game or not, taking them away again tends to make players angry. Anyway, the fourth thing actually comes in extension of started and stopped projects. PvP. I don't even know if I need to say more. Achievements all over the place referencing old PvP modes that haven't existed for years. Borderland Ruins Secure is a frontline map that has been disabled since the middle of 2023, and while it says, due to revisions being made to the PvP system, this duty is temporarily unavailable. Further announcements will be made in upcoming patch notes or similar. Let's just revisit the fact that 7.1 saw an additional rework to how PvP works, and it didn't include re-implementing this map. So it turns out this map returns in 7.2, revealed in the most recent live letter. We also have Rival Wings, which I imagine most players don't even know exists. Why does it not have a daily roulette like Frontline does? And also speaking of which, Astragalus is also quote-unquote temporarily unavailable, but I had trouble finding for how long. Back when the series reward system was implemented in Endwalker, we were told initially that the various series rewards would eventually be available again. So there was no need to worry about fear of missing out. More items have been added that trophy crystals can be spent on, but the sheer amount of trophy crystals offered each series, at least to me, greatly overwhelms the amount of crystals you'd need to buy everything. I guess, technically, we were never told how these series rewards would return, but trophy crystals seem like the obvious path. Unless, of course, the plan is to release them as store items when enough time has passed that we forgot how these items were originally acquired. Again, in the most recent live letter, Yoshi P specifically stated they are thinking about making the rewards from past PvP series obtainable again. So, hooray, I guess? Anyway, my point is that PvP is another case of a type of content that is getting attention, but weirdly not quite enough, I would say. The fifth thing is just a general example of a tool that was added in the game that may have inspired the opposite of confidence for the player base. Back in Stormblood, the duty recorder was added to the game. This enables you to record a battle and then rewatch the battle with the ability to turn your camera and review the fight as you wish. Some things are missing here and there, like it can be difficult to track cooldowns and whatnot, and the exact way characters move around looks a bit different. However, the general idea is amazing, except it tends to only be allowed at all for 3 to 4 duties that are pretty much never currently relevant. For the duty record, the current list of recordable duties include Walker-Ladder, Dawntrail Trial 1, normal, Interforce, Dawntrail Trial 3, normal, Thalea, Endwalker's 3rd Alliance raid, why? And M4S, but as I recall, M4S was added to the list in 7.1, not in 7.05. The duties are so randomly specific that it is difficult to entirely understand why these are chosen. However, I heard a fascinating suggestion somewhat recently, that the duty recorder may be an extension of a tool, or may just be the tool the development team uses for getting their trailer footage and images. And Perhaps when they release 7.0, they're already working on 7.1, they probably are, so the duties they need footage from for 7.0 are recorded in some version of 7.1, and they cycle out the duties in the list as needed. I don't know, it sounds a bit tinfoil hat in a way, but it also sounds incredibly believable considering the duties on the list, right? Now, what is more important to this is that this tool existing in the game and being nigh unusable from the get-go certainly never has inspired much confidence in future additions in the game like it. At some point in Endwalker, I believe, we were teased the idea of a raid planner-like tool in-game. But when is it coming, and when it does, will it then be limited to like 4 duties again, making it kinda pointless? I hope you understand why players would be concerned like this. And finally, for the 6th thing, Levequests. In Heavensward, temple leves were added, I guess as an attempt to expand a bit on the content. But when that didn't really work or matter, combat leves were discontinued by Stormblood. Levequests overall are a decent way to level up jobs, whether it is crafters and gatherers or in super low levels, it is an option for combat jobs, although most players find it much less efficient than other options. Aside from leveling, Levequests typically serve a purpose mainly for guild making when occasionally a Levequest gets weirdly balanced so that the cost of the quest items are dwarfed by the reward, like the coffee biscuits did back in Shadowbringers. They've since been nerfed, of course. The only other way Levequests typically stay relevant now is through the various Levequest achievements. But I don't think having an achievement for doing a ludicrous amount of a time-limited task, Leve Allowance, causing players to do it just for the sake of doing it, necessarily counts as a great success. I'm not entirely sure what would be a good solution here, but I do think a start would be to revisit the Leve Allowance part. Maybe let the Leve Allowance be what enables you to receive the big cash rewards and whatnot, and then allow players to spam Leves as they please beyond that if they just want to do them for the achievements or something. Now, I'm not saying that all of these pieces of content and issues are easily solved or even are relevant to solve. Case in point, if a lot of time was invested in fixing Levequests now, it would probably not be well received. But this kind of stuff is what can make an aging game difficult to pick up, because there are all these old and abandoned projects and content that can mislead and confuse. Indeed, changing anything like that risks making those that like it the way it is angry, but at some point, maybe the band-aid may need to be ripped. I don't know, but what do you think? Do you think these various oddities and types of disrepair in Final Fantasy XIV is what adds to the concerns of the players, or is this all just a case of, oh, that's part of the charm of the game, leave it alone? I would love to hear about it all in the comments. Also, psych, I have a 7th thing. How many times have you seen a newer player ask how they rank up past captain in their grand company, only to have to disappoint them by saying, that content has been abandoned for years? Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, before Endwalker, we used to have an additional equipment slot, the belt. Unlike all other equipment in the game, belts were always completely invisible and were for all intents and purposes, stat sticks. Endwalker removed these, but also came with a stat squish on top that could hide it a bit. But supposedly, the stats of the belts were redistributed across the rest of the gear we wear. And the armory chest space was mostly distributed between weapons and rings, which is also why the armory chest looks a bit weird as you flip through it with the other gear types just having an empty area.